September 11th, 1995. It's a sleepy Monday morning in Videtta, Georgia, a rural crossroads between Savannah and Atlanta.
We're just a little small community.
It probably didn't have a population of over 200.
There was a flashing light in the main intersection and a convenience store, but mostly it's agricultural.
This morning, the sun still hangs low over the horizon when Jasmine Jenkins pulls up outside the home of her sister, Brenda Palmer.
It was their practice that her sister would come pick her up in the morning and they would go over into Jefferson County where they worked at a sewing plant.
But today, when Jasmine arrives, Brenda isn't waiting outside.
Come on, Brenda!
She blew the horn, no one answered.
Thinking her sister had overslept, Jasmine goes to the door.
We're going to be late!
The front door is slightly open. And she starts to get like this funny feeling that something is not right.
Brenda?
She's at the door, no one answered, so she went in there.
She sees Brenda's teenage daughter, Christine, who normally sleeps in the front room.
Only she wasn't asleep.
She was laying in the bed with a bullet hole in her head.
In a panic, Jasmine runs back to Brenda's bedroom.
She looked inside the other room and she seen my sister stretched out.
She had 2 bullet wounds to the head.
31-year-old Brenda Jenkins Palmer had always been a small-town girl.
We grew up in the country part of Videtta. Everybody got along. I mean, it was just a little great town.
Though life wasn't always easy for Brenda growing up, she was always surrounded by love.
Her father passed, then my father passed. So the 2 families, my mom and her mother, sisters, we kind of grew up together like sisters and brothers.
As the oldest of her siblings, Brenda learned to pull her weight at a young age.
She helped take care of her other siblings. When we was younger, she got a job. She did all that running around and paid the bills for the family, helping out as much as she could.
And she always set a good example.
She was a church-going person. She wasn't the type of person that caused trouble. She always been there to help somebody. She was just a great all-around person.
She was also an outstanding mother.
She had a child at a young age.
The father was never in Christine's life, so brother played both roles in raising her daughter.
Under her mother's loving care, Christine thrived.
They spent a lot of time together. Brother kept Christine in the church.
Christine was a good student. She was on the honor roll and in the marching band. She was apparently a very happy person.
And Brenda was happy too. But there was one thing missing.
Brenda was looking for love.
And then she found it with an older man named Willie Palmer.
Willie, he had like a little club that he served food and stuff.
What can I get you?
I don't know. I've never been here before.
Well, I'm the owner. Ask me anything.
This is your place?
Absolutely.
He was from a well-known family in that area.
You grew up around here?
Yeah, just down the road where I grew up.
I can't believe we've never met.
I know, right? You're gorgeous, by the way.
They hit it off. It was like almost love at first sight.
As the couple grew closer, they formed a beautiful blended family.
He seemed to accept Brenda's daughter, Christine, and Brenda accepted his 3 children from a previous marriage.
Brenda also grew close to Willie's teenage nephew, Frederico.
Hey, Brenda, can you pick me up after practice today?
Sure, hon.
All right. Hey, I'll see you.
She actually loved Fred. She did a lot of good things for him.
Before long, Brenda and Willie married and bought some property out in the country.
It was 5 or 6 acres all together.
It's a nice piece of land.
And a new home wasn't all the couple had to celebrate.
The baby came along. They was doing good. He was good to Brenda.
But now Brenda's sister has just walked into a horrific scene.
Brenda's daughter was shot in the face in her bed, and then Brenda was shot in the head.
Oh, thank God.
Miraculously, Brenda's infant daughter was unharmed.
She was just lying on the bed, not obviously realizing what had happened.
Then, trying to collect herself, Jasmine picks up the phone to call 911.
This is 1995, so all she had was a landline.
What the?
But when she picks it up, there's no dial tone.
What? The phone line is dead.
In 1995, after raising her daughter Christine as a single mom, 31-year-old Brenda Jenkins Palmer had found happiness again with her new husband, 42-year-old Willie Palmer.
Willie and Brenda also had a 1-year-old daughter of their own.
It was a great blended family.
But now, Brenda's sister has walked into a horrifying scene inside her sister's home.
Brenda was lying on the floor. She had 2 bullet wounds to the head. Christine, she had been shot in the face.
However, Brenda and Willie's baby girl was unharmed.
That child was on the bed with the daughter, Christine.
With the home phone dead, Brenda's sister takes the baby and races out the door.
This is 1995 in rural Georgia, so few people had cell phones.
She ran back out the door and ran to the local convenience store, and she told him to dial 911.
But when first responders reach the tiny rural crossroads where Brenda lives, there's no saving her or her daughter.
They're both pronounced dead at the scene.
Get her out of here. Just... Man, what is he going to do?
And while Brenda's little girl appears unharmed, first responders tending to her in the ambulance decide to transport her to the hospital, just to be sure.
They also allowed Brenda's sister to accompany the child.
She was crying. She couldn't talk.
What are you saying, GBI?
Given the magnitude of the case, Burke County Police call in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
The GBI took over in the investigation because it was a double murder and a little bit more complex.
It takes time for agents to reach the remote location, deep in the Georgia countryside.
I couldn't see the house from the road because of a twisty driveway that led from the highway to the house.
When we arrived, we kind of did a walk through the scene.
The first thing the investigators notice is the broken lock on the front door.
The door was kicked in.
And inside the door was the first victim, Brenda's daughter, Christine.
Right there in that front room, it was a little twin-sized bed.
She was partially sitting up in the bed, and I could see a wound on her face. There was blood on the bed and a little bit of blood spatter on the other side.
in the line of business. Some are worse than others, and this was one of the worst ones, especially when you see a 15-year-old kid shot in the face.
Examining her, I noted on top of a sheet that was covering her leg a cartridge casing.
The investigators bagged the shell casing as evidence before heading into the next room.
And there was Brenda lying on the floor.
There was some sheets that her feet had gotten tangled into.
She was obviously pulled out of bed.
No!
There was blood coming from her head.
She had 2 bullet wounds.
Nearby, the investigators find 2 more cartridge casings that are a match for the one they found in Christine's bed.
They were 22 long rifle casings.
Then, after finding the phone line dead, the investigators head outside to check the wiring.
There was a telephone interface box attached to the house. This interface box would be where the wire comes from the telephone company, and you would run wires into the house for the telephone service.
But in this case, the box had been opened and the wires disconnected.
Suspecting the killer had disconnected the phone before heading inside, the investigators removed the interface box from the house.
We took the telephone interface box to be processed for a fingerprint.
That may eventually give investigators the suspect's identity. But the motive behind the murders remains a mystery.
You don't know if it's a robbery gone bad or whatever.
And it's not like there are any potential witnesses nearby.
She lived in an isolated area down this 2-lane dirt logging road.
However, the investigators do have someone to turn to. Brenda's family has begun to gather outside the crime scene tape.
I got a call from my cousin. Something really bad happened down here in Videtta. What's going on?
Unfortunately, Brenda and Christine were murdered.
It just shocked me. I didn't know what to think or what to do. I mean, it's just like everybody almost lost it.
Everybody was getting all upset and talking crazy and everything, man. It was a bad day for the whole family.
But as Brenda's brother speaks with the investigators, his shock quickly turns to suspicion.
Who do you think might have done this?
Her husband, Willie Palmer. He was the first one came to my mind.
The relationship between the two was very volatile.
She had filed for divorce.
The family of Brenda Jenkins Palmer has just told Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents that they believe her husband, Willie Palmer, was behind the shooting that killed her and her daughter, Christine.
I was just about 95% sure what had happened was because of him.
Willie was the most obvious because of the problems they were having.
According to the family, Brenda had recently filed for divorce.
They say that things between Willie and Brenda had started off well.
When they first started, their relationship was great. From what I saw, they was doing good and everything.
They were living up in Gulf, which is a different community than Videtta.
But not long after the baby was born, Brenda and the girls moved out.
She didn't give me an explanation. She never would go into details on nothing. She never told me why.
Was she abusive? She didn't mention no abuse to us.
However, Brenda's actions suggest the answer may be yes.
Brenda had to get a restraining order against him.
And when Willie violated it, she had him arrested.
He was sent to county jail.
And while he was in jail, Brenda looked for a new place for her and her daughters to live.
She tried to make sure that he would not be able to find her.
In a big city, That might mean a women's shelter, but not deep in rural Georgia.
She had to just find a small house somewhere out in the middle of nowhere.
And she found it at the end of a dirt road on the outskirts of Videtta.
The residence was basically a two-room shack.
It's a sad thing to know that somebody had to live in it, and even sadder that somebody died in it.
It was only supposed to be temporary.
From what she told me, she had money saved up and she was working on getting her a better place.
But she'd barely settled in when her cousin learned that Willie was out of jail.
I walked in the house and I said, brother, I said, I just seen him. She said, that can't be. He ain't no way. I said, I just seen him at the phone booth. And she sat there for a minute and I said, I just want to let you know he out. And she acted like it wasn't really nothing serious about it.
When was that?
Couple days ago.
That actually was my last conversation with her. I don't know if she was frightened or concerned or what, but I know 2 days later, all this happened.
And now that Brenda and her daughter are dead, the family is convinced that Willie had something to do with it.
So you think that he came out here to the house and killed her?
It had to be him. He was trying to find her, but he didn't know where she was at. How he found out about it, I don't know.
Had Willie shot and killed his estranged wife and stepdaughter?
The pending divorce did give him a possible motive.
And that's not the only thing that suggests he might be responsible.
That Brenda Palmer and Christine were shot and killed, but the baby was not, indicated that there was a reason for the baby not to be killed.
The investigators suspected the reason is a simple one.
And that was the love of the child.
Willie may have hesitated to hurt his own flesh and blood.
We'll be in touch. Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
With Willie now a person of interest, the investigators bring him in for questioning.
Obviously, you want to either put him in the homicide or eliminate him.
Although when the interview begins, Willie seems surprised by the news that his stepdaughter and Brenda are dead.
What about the baby?
She's fine.
Thank God.
Willie admits that he and Brenda had problems, but he claims to have moved on from the relationship.
When Brenda and Willie's relationship was ending, he reached back out to his previous wife, Suzanne, and convinced her that they should give it another try. And she let him move back in.
And he said that once Brenda had put him in jail for violating the restraining order, he realized that there was no going back.
Okay. So have you seen her since you got out of jail?
Yeah, a couple days ago I went over to a new spot just to get the rest of my stuff.
So you were out there on Sunday night?
Willie denied any involvement in the death of Christine and Brenda.
So where were you that night?
I was with my nephew, Federico.
He said they were in Augusta, away from the area.
I was with him all day.
All right, that's all for now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
And when the GBI agents contact Federico, he confirms his uncle's story.
He said they drove to Augusta.
But did that mean it was true, or was Willie's nephew just covering for him?
Federico was a lot younger. He was a late teenager.
I believe Federico was actually really scared of Willie Palmer.
With doubts about Willie's alibi, the investigators head back to the tiny crossroads of Videtta.
There's just one store in Videtta, just a little country store, and nothing else.
What's going on?
Good afternoon, sir.
But that one country store had just what the investigators need.
Yeah, I was here at the store when she came in to call the police.
Yeah?
I knew Willie was up to something when he passed by the night before.
The witness put Willie in the area that night.
He saw Willie's car pass by on the night of the murder.
I knew Willie was up to something.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents believe they may be one step closer to solving the murders of Brenda Jenkins Palmer and her teenage daughter, Christine.
A clerk at the county store near Brenda's house says he saw Willie's car pass by on the night of the murder.
He's an important witness that put Willie in the area.
Are you sure it was Willie?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Willie.
This was a little small community. Basically, everybody knew each other.
We all attend the same churches, the same schools, work in the same places, shop in the same areas.
And the clerk isn't the only one who was pretty sure Willie had committed the murders.
Willie Palmer was a very dangerous man to be around. And that's not from me, that's coming from the people in that area.
However, Willie's reputation around the county wasn't the only reason people thought he was behind the murders.
A lot of people was coming at me and telling me, said, well, he said he was going to kill her.
Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Homicide?
And it wasn't long before those stories started making their way back to the GBI agents investigating the murders.
Willie Palmer said that he was going to kill Brenda Jenkins, and he said, y'all watch me. He said, I mean what I say.
Homicide.
Willie Palmer had been going all over Burke County basically saying he was going to kill Brenda.
He said, I'm going to do it execution style. And you'll see.
And that's exactly what happened.
He was referring to Brenda Jenkins. Yeah.
It was becoming clear that he was responsible for their murders.
And the picture becomes even clearer when a woman named Tammy Howell contacts the investigators and says she has information about the murders.
Homicide.
Tammy worked at a loan company and Brenda was a customer.
About a month ago, Brenda came in. She was nervous acting because she was scared of going home. So she had just put him in jail.
She begged her not to tell Willie where she moved to because she did not want him to find her.
She said that she was scared he got out of jail and he was
Tammy says that Willie had come in a few weeks later.
He said he just gotten out of jail.
Willie was at the loan company trying to borrow money for an attorney for dealing with the restraining order that Brenda had taken against him.
And according to Tammy, he was obviously upset about it.
He said something like, the last thing he does is go kill that.
Tammy said that she and her co-workers didn't take Willie too seriously at the time.
He was always a polite person, and that's why we didn't really think anything else because we just thought it was like anger. You know, get angry, just to the face things.
They didn't really think he would do it.
Still, she had done as Brenda asked.
The lady at the loan company would not tell Willie Palmer where Brenda was living.
But had Willie somehow found out and followed through on his threats?
A lot of people did know where Brenda lived during that time, and it would almost be virtually impossible to keep someone from finding that out.
Have a seat right over here, please.
Their suspicion of Willie deepening. The investigators ask his ex-wife Suzanne to come to the station to see if she has any information.
My sister Brenda and Suzanne, they knew each other pretty good.
Willie had also told them he reconnected with Suzanne after he split up with Brenda.
So how long were you and Willie married?
10 years.
What happened?
His temper mostly.
Before he married Brenda, there was a history of problems with his first wife.
Suzanne also confirms that after Brenda left Willie, she had decided to give him another chance.
Things were going okay between Suzanne and Willie for a while, but it wasn't long before she remembered why they broke up in the first place.
His temper came back.
Oh yeah, he sure did.
Willie became so irate and he started making all these threats.
I gotta be honest with you. I was relieved when Brenda put him back in jail.
She was actually also very scared of Willie.
And according to Suzanne, she had good reason to be.
He had recently tried to kill her.
I was relieved when Brenda put him back in jail.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents have just learned that their lead suspect, Willie Palmer, had tried to kill his ex-wife Suzanne, too.
When did this happen?
The night before Brenda was killed.
Suzanne was in the car with her sister and Willie rammed into the back of them, trying to run them off the road.
Then he chased us for over a mile till I drove up to that fire hall.
She was petrified.
It was becoming clear that if anybody was going to be responsible for killing Brenda, it was Willie.
All right. Thank you for coming. I'll walk you out.
Hoping to prove it, the investigators decide it's time to lean on Willie's nephew, Frederico Palmer.
We want to talk about the night of Sunday, September 10th.
Frederico was Willie's alibi for the night of the murder.
But he was also the murder plot's weakest link.
I confronted Frederico, telling him, "Frederico, you were there, weren't you?" And he goes, "Yep."
He told me to come ride somewhere with him.
Frederico says Willie had initially told him that they were going to Augusta, which is the same story given to the investigators.
But rather than going to that nightclub, they went toward Videtta.
And he said, "Get me, should he do it?" I said, "No."
Should he do what?
Should burn him.
Frederico says he tried to talk his uncle out of it, but it was no use.
Willie has his mind made up.
He said, "I got to do it." But she trying to take everything he got.
Did he mention Christine?
Not till we got down there.
According to Frederico, once they drove down the dirt road that led to Brenda's house, Willie stopped the car and then pulled a rifle out from the back seat.
What kind of gun is it?
Kind of good.
22, right?
Yep.
A 22 is a match for the shell casings recovered at the crime scene.
Then, after taking the gun, Willie told his nephew to drive.
He told me to go park the car and walk back down.
Back to the house?
Yeah, I need your help with something.
Okay.
He felt like he didn't have a choice.
It was either you help me or else I will get you.
Frederico says when he walked back down to the house, his uncle was fumbling around with a telephone box outside.
Man, the damn thing won't... Yeah, you try.
So, let me ask you this. Who opened the box up?
Howard.
And what you did when you got it open?
Pull a plug in, pull it up.
He asked Frederico to undo the phone line, which he obliged.
Frederico says that by the time he finished disconnecting the phone line, Willie was already pounding on Brenda's front door.
Brenda, wake up!
They keep the door in. Then he went in, and I heard a shot.
Willie basically raised the rifle and just shot her straight between the eyes.
Then, leaving Christine dead in the front room, Willie proceeded into Brenda's room.
My sister woke up and she grabbed the baby.
She grabbed the baby because she knew that he would never harm the baby.
He was in there talking to her, come on, give me the baby. And she won't get it to him. So he told her to get the baby from him.
Give me the baby! Give me the baby! Fred, get in here! Get the baby.
His nephew pulled out of my sister's arm.
Look at me.
Last night, the baby and Veronica on the floor.
Frederico said he then took the baby out of the residence.
And once he was on the porch, he heard shots.
How many shots do you hear?
2 a day.
Then, according to Frederico, Willie came out onto the porch and told him to take the baby back inside.
He said, pull him down this avenue.
So y'all left the baby laying there, tried to run, it didn't show.
Yeah, he
Is that
pulled.
correct?
Yeah.
Frederico says they then went back to Willie's home, changed clothes, and disposed of the evidence.
Frederico told me Willie ended up throwing the clothing that he wore and the .22 rifle in a creek that was located on Highway 305 in Burke County.
It's a compelling story. But is it the truth?
Frederico said they left the baby with Brenda, but that's not where Brenda's sister found her.
That morning, she came in and found Christine on the bed with the baby.
It's conceivable that the baby had crawled into the bed with her half-sister at some point during the night.
So, to verify the rest of his story, GBI agents head to the creek where Frederico claimed Willie disposed of the evidence.
We ended up getting a guy from Burke County Emergency Management Association to come out to the scene where he claimed Willie Palmer threw clothing, shoes, and a rifle. And it wasn't long he found the rifle.
The investigators sent the rifle, a .22, to the state crime lab.
They test fired the .22 rifle that we recovered out of the creek, compared it to casings inside the residence, and it was a match.
It's more than enough for the investigators to charge Willie with Brenda and Christine's murders.
They understood our pain, and they wanted justice for my sister just like I did.
This was a death penalty case.
And everything about the case pointed towards Willie.
Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents have arrested 42-year-old Willie Palmer for the murder of his estranged wife Brenda Jenkins Palmer and her teenage daughter.
The prosecutors have announced that they intend to pursue the death penalty.
Despite the seriousness of the charges, Willie refuses to talk.
That's the coldest man I've ever been involved with trying to talk to in my career.
But will his silence matter?
The prosecutors also charged Willie's nephew, Frederico Palmer, for his role in the murders.
The district attorney felt like Frederico was as guilty as Willie, and I do too. His own actions that he admitted put him right in the middle of it, and everything he said fit. There was nothing that he told me that I could disprove.
And now the prosecutors need Frederico to tell his story to a jury.
To have an eyewitness co-conspirator testimony, you don't get that a lot. And so his testimony was extremely important.
They offered Frederico life without parole rather than a death sentence if he would testify.
He agreed to plead guilty and testify against his uncle.
When Willie goes on trial in April of 1997, the prosecutors portray him as a man with a vendetta.
It was because of anger, wrath, a need for revenge.
Brenda got him locked up after he violated his restraining order, and she was also fighting him in court.
When they divorced, he wanted his property.
Willie's mind was made up.
We don't know exactly how he found out where she lived, but a lot of people did know. And I think that's how word got back to Willie.
Then, on the night of September 10th, Willie and his nephew Frederico snuck up Brenda's long, remote drive.
Frederico undid the phone line.
Willie kicked the door in, shot Christine in the head.
He then went in Brenda's room, and Brenda had the baby in her arms.
Fred, get in here!
So Willie told Frederico, get the baby from her.
No!
Frederico got the baby, and then Willie shot Brenda twice.
Basically, she was executed.
It's just, gruesome.
But despite strong evidence and his nephew testifying against him, the prosecutors are still unable to convict Willie.
The first trial was a mistrial.
The defense claimed the DA's office did not provide one of the statements I took from Frederico, which in fact they did have it, because I found it in their discovery notes, which is what is given to the defense. So that means they had it, but they claimed they didn't, and the judge called it mistrial.
2 more trials followed, but the prosecutors could never make a conviction stick.
It seemed like there were a number of issues. I think the main reason was being tried in Burke County, where everybody knew each other. They just couldn't find a jury that could agree.
A juror's insight is so different from my insight or a defense attorney's insight. And this was a death penalty case. It was a big decision.
Then the next trial, there was the issue of Mr. Palmer's intellectual disability, or whether he had one.
Since he was never acquitted, Willie remains in prison the entire time.
He was not going to get bond. They sent him back to Burke County Jail, where he remains until he's tried again.
But the family and the prosecution are determined to get justice for Brenda and Christine.
I knew what the right verdict was. I knew we had the right guy.
And in 2023, almost 30 years after the murders, Willie stands trial for a 4th time.
When we retried him again, the death penalty was taken off the table.
And this time, the prosecution finally gets a conviction that sticks.
They find him guilty on all counts.
Willie got life without parole.
After such a long, long wait, it's a satisfying outcome.
He won't never get out of prison.
He won't do this to nobody else.
But while justice has been served, the murders of Brenda and her 15-year-old daughter Christine remain a senseless tragedy.
These 2 individuals did not deserve to have their life end.
Brenda was always doing everything she can to make life better for everybody that she could.
Christine never harmed anyone in her life.
She would have been, 45 or so now, having a family of her own.
There's no reason for this to occur like it did. None.
The cemetery worker thought he had found something that did not belong there. It was the morning of July 15, 1982, in Blairstown Township, New Jersey. Cedar Ridge Cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to a rural cemetery on a summer morning. Headstones stood in neat rows. Trees moved in the heat. Beyond the grounds, the land fell away toward a wooded area and a stream. Then a worker noticed the body. A young woman was lying near the edge of the cemetery, down an embankment. She was dead. And her face had been so brutally beaten that investigators could not recognize her. There was no identification. No wallet. No obvious clue that could immediately tell police who she was. Just a teenage girl who had died violently and had apparently been left among strangers. For investigators, the first question was simple. Who was she? For the next 40 years, that question would become one of the most haunting mysteries in New Jersey. The girl would eventually become known around the country as Princess Doe. But on that morning, she was simply an unidentified victim. A Jane Doe. A girl without a name. Authorities estimated that she was in her mid to late teens. She was small, roughly 5 feet 2 inches tall and around 100 pounds. Her brown hair fell to about shoulder length. She wore distinctive clothing. A red shirt. A patterned wraparound skirt. A gold-colored necklace with a cross. There were other details investigators carefully recorded. Her left ear appeared to have been pierced twice. The fingernails on her right hand carried red polish, while the left hand did not. Small details. Almost painfully ordinary. Yet those details were all investigators had. Her body showed signs that she had fought. There were injuries to her hands and arms consistent with defensive wounds. Someone had attacked her. Someone had killed her. And then someone had left her body at the cemetery. The violence was so severe that investigators immediately understood that identification would not be easy. In 1982, forensic technology was nothing like it is today. There was no investigative genetic genealogy. No enormous consumer DNA databases. No modern system capable of turning a degraded biological sample into a family tree. There were fingerprints when available. Dental records. Photographs. Missing person reports. Witnesses. And luck. Investigators needed someone to recognize her. But nobody did. The investigation spread outward. Authorities circulated descriptions. They examined missing person cases. They compared photographs. They followed tips. Every possibility mattered because somewhere, perhaps hundreds of miles away, a family might be searching for a daughter who had simply vanished. And then came the name. Princess Doe. It was not her real name. It was a name given to her because investigators refused to let the unidentified teenager become merely another anonymous body in a case file. The nickname was emotional, almost symbolic. She was somebody's daughter. Somebody's sister. Somebody who had once had a room, a birthday, a childhood, a voice. But none of those things could be recovered from the cemetery. Only her body remained. And for months, investigators searched for the person who could tell them who she was. The case soon attracted enormous public attention. People began looking at the clothing, the necklace, the unusual skirt, the physical description. Could she have been a runaway? Could she have been from another state? Had she traveled under an alias? Had someone deliberately hidden her identity? Each possibility opened another door. And behind every door was another dead end. One theory would eventually point investigators toward California. Another toward Maryland. Another toward Long Island. For years, Princess Doe's identity seemed to shift depending on which clue investigators were following. One missing girl appeared to fit. Then DNA ruled her out. Another possibility emerged. Then it collapsed. The case became a maze. And the deeper investigators went, the more difficult the mystery became. Yet the cemetery never forgot her. The community did not allow her to disappear completely. Her remains were eventually buried near the place where she had been found. There was a grave. There was a headstone. But there was no family name. No photograph of a smiling teenager. No complete biography. Only Princess Doe. a name that was never supposed to become permanent. But it did. The years passed. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. The technology changed. The investigators changed. The people who had originally worked the case grew older and retired. Some died. Others kept the file. And the girl remained. A teenager frozen in July 1982. The case became one of the most recognizable unidentified person investigations in the United States. Her story appeared on television. Her reconstruction was shown to millions. The public was asked to look at her face and remember someone. But there was a cruel problem. The face investigators reconstructed was an approximation. The real face had been destroyed. The person who knew her best could not step forward. And every passing year made memory less reliable. People moved. Families changed. Records disappeared. Witnesses forgot. Potential witnesses died. The case grew colder. But it never completely disappeared. Then, decades after the body was discovered, investigators began looking at an entirely different kind of evidence. DNA. The remains were exhumed in 1999 so that samples could be obtained for testing. It was a turning point. Not because the answer came immediately. It did not. Instead, the process became another long chapter in the investigation. Samples were tested. New techniques emerged. Old evidence was reconsidered. Technology advanced. The case waited. Princess Doe waited. In 2005, an extraordinary development occurred. A man named Arthur Kinlaw, already incarcerated in New York, contacted authorities. He claimed responsibility for the murder of the unidentified girl found in Blairstown. It was an astonishing allegation. For 23 years, investigators had searched for the killer. Now a prisoner was saying he had done it. But there was a problem. The victim still had no identity. A confession is powerful. But a confession without sufficient corroboration can be difficult to build into a prosecutable case. Investigators needed more. They needed to establish who had died. They needed evidence connecting Kinlaw to that person. They needed to transform a decades-old mystery into a case that could survive scrutiny. And so the confession did not immediately end the investigation. It became another piece of the puzzle. Kinlaw made additional admissions over the years. Authorities continued examining the evidence. But Princess Doe remained unidentified. That meant the case still carried a terrible uncertainty. The investigators knew someone had died. They suspected they knew who was responsible. But they still did not know the most basic fact. Her name. Then technology began changing what was possible. DNA testing became more sophisticated. Old biological material that once seemed useless could now contain information. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children contacted the Warren County Prosecutor's Office and offered assistance in obtaining a new DNA extraction and developing a genealogical profile. Astrea Forensics became involved. The evidence was old. The victim had been dead for nearly 4 decades. But the investigation was no longer limited to the technology of 1982. The DNA profile was developed. Then came the search for relatives. Not a photograph. Not a missing person poster. Not a witness who suddenly remembered a face. A genetic trail. A family tree built from fragments. Investigators began looking for living relatives whose DNA could help establish the identity of the unknown girl. In February 2022, a genealogical profile pointed toward a possible answer. The name was Dawn Olenek, a teenage girl from Long Island. Born in 1964. 17 years old when she disappeared. Suddenly, the 40-year-old mystery had a direction. Investigators located potential relatives. They compared DNA. A sister provided a sample. More testing followed. And on April 29, 2022, the answer finally came. Princess Doe was Dawn Olenek. 40 years after a young woman was found dead in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, the unidentified victim finally had her name back. She had not come from some distant unknown world. She had come from New York. She had been 17. She had a family. She had gone to school. She had lived an ordinary life before becoming the center of one of America's most enduring cold cases. And suddenly the name on the grave could change. Princess Doe was no longer just Princess Doe. She was Dawn Olenek. But the revelation did not erase the mystery. Deepened it. Because now investigators could ask the questions that had been impossible to ask before. Where had Dawn been? Who had last seen her alive? How had she traveled from New York to New Jersey? Why had she been there? And what exactly happened during the final hours of her life? Authorities said witness accounts indicated that Kinlaw had met Dawn and attempted to lure her into prostitution. According to prosecutors, she refused. The alleged confrontation ended with Dawn being driven to New Jersey, where she was killed. Kinlaw was eventually charged with first-degree murder. He was already serving a sentence in New York for 2 other first-degree murder convictions. The case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve had suddenly become something different. A homicide prosecution. A victim with a name. A suspect already behind bars. And a family finally able to say where Dawn was. For 4 decades, the world had called her Princess Doe. But Dawn had never been a mystery to herself. She had been a teenager. She had hopes. Fears. Arguments. Friends. A family. A life that ended before she had the chance to become an adult. The cemetery gave investigators her body. Science eventually gave them her name. But 40 years could not be returned. And that is what makes the story of Princess Doe so haunting. The greatest mystery was not whether she had existed. She had. The mystery was why it took so long for the world to remember her. For decades, visitors came to Cedar Ridge Cemetery and saw a headstone bearing the name Princess Doe. A name created because nobody knew the truth. A name that became a symbol for unidentified victims everywhere. Her case helped demonstrate how important unidentified person databases could become. She was entered into the National Crime Information Center in 1983, becoming a landmark case in the history of unidentified victims. Investigators kept the file alive. Families of missing people continued to search. Advances in DNA eventually transformed what had once seemed impossible. And then, one April day in 2022, the name finally emerged. Dawn Olenek. The girl behind the nickname. The person behind the photograph. The daughter behind the case file. The teenager behind the grave. 40 years earlier, someone had tried to leave her where no one would know who she was. But they failed. They could destroy her face. They could remove her identity from the immediate investigation. They could leave her among strangers. But they could not erase her completely. Because somebody kept looking. Somebody kept testing. Somebody kept asking questions. And somewhere inside decades-old evidence, her name was still waiting. Not in a newspaper. Not on a missing poster. Not in a witness's fading memory. In her DNA. And when science finally found the path back to her family, Princess Doe disappeared. Not because she was forgotten, but because she was remembered. Her name was Dawn Olenek. And after 40 years, the unknown girl in the cemetery was finally a daughter again. The name Dawn Olenek answered one question that had haunted investigators for 4 decades. But it immediately created another. What happened to Dawn before she was found in that cemetery? A name could restore an identity. It could connect a photograph to a family. It could transform an unidentified victim into a real person. But it could not automatically reconstruct the final days of her life. For that, investigators had to go backward. Far beyond the cemetery. Far beyond the headlines. Back to Long Island. Back to the girl Dawn had been before anyone called her Princess Doe. She had been 17. That single fact made the case even more disturbing. 17 is an age associated with unfinished lives. School. Friends. Family arguments. Plans for the future. The ordinary uncertainty of adolescence. Dawn never reached adulthood. Instead, her life ended hundreds of miles from home, and for 40 years the people who loved her did not know where she had gone. Her disappearance had become another mystery layered beneath the murder. When did she leave? Why did she leave? Who was with her? And why did nobody find her? Those questions became critical once her identity was established. Investigators now had something they had never possessed before. A family history. Relatives. Photographs. A hometown. A timeline. And most importantly, people who could remember Dawn as a living human being rather than a reconstruction created from skeletal remains. For decades, investigators have been forced to describe Princess Doe by physical characteristics. Height. Weight. Hair. Clothing. Jewelry. Dental information. DNA. But a family could provide something forensic evidence never could. Memory. They could say what she sounded like. How she walked. What she liked. What she hated. What made her laugh. What frightened her. What she called the people closest to her. Those details did not solve the homicide. But they restored something the killer had taken away. Her individuality. The girl behind the evidence. And that distinction mattered. Because cold cases can slowly turn victims into objects. A photograph. A number. File. A set of remains. A date. Investigators work with evidence because evidence can be measured. Families work with memory because memory is personal. For 40 years, Dawn's family had been trapped between those two worlds. They knew she had disappeared. They did not know where she was. They could not visit her grave. They could not know what happened. They could not even be certain whether the young woman buried in New Jersey was their daughter. Then science connected them. The confirmation did more than put a name on a headstone. It changed the emotional geography of the case. The unknown girl was suddenly somebody's missing daughter. The cemetery was no longer the place where an anonymous teenager had been found. It became the place where Dawn had been waiting for her family. For decades. The irony was devastating. Her family had been searching for a missing teenager. Investigators had been searching for an unidentified murder victim. They were searching for the same person. But neither side knew it. 2 investigations. 1 girl. Separated by distance, incomplete records and time. And somewhere in the middle was the person responsible for her death. Arthur Kinlaw. His name had been present in the investigation for years. Long before Dawn was identified. His confession had surfaced in 2005. He claimed responsibility. Yet the confession alone did not immediately provide the closure investigators needed. There were still questions about what had happened. Questions about the circumstances. Questions about the evidence. Questions about whether the confession could be independently corroborated. And above all, there was the problem that the victim had no name. Imagine trying to prosecute the murder of a person whose identity is unknown. The state could prove that someone had died. Could prove the death was violent. It could establish where the body was found. It could potentially connect a suspect to the killing. But the victim remained officially unidentified. The case existed in an uncomfortable space. Everyone knew there had been a murder. Almost nobody knew who had been murdered. Then the genetic investigation changed the equation. The breakthrough did not arrive with a dramatic witness running into a police station. It did not come from a forgotten photograph discovered in an attic. It came from technology that had barely existed when Dawn died. Investigative genetic genealogy had transformed cold case investigations across the United States. The principle was powerful. Instead of asking, "Who is this person?" investigators could ask a different question. Who are this person's relatives? DNA could point toward a family. A family could point toward an individual. And an individual could finally give a forgotten victim a name. For Princess Doe, that process took years of scientific development. The original evidence had survived. That mattered. Every fragment preserved in the case file represented a possibility. Something that investigators in 1982 could not use might become valuable decades later. The investigation was no longer confined to the limitations of the past. That was the difference between a cold case and a dead case. A cold case could still move. Could wait. It could remain silent. And then suddenly new technology could make an old clue speak. The DNA evidence eventually led investigators toward Dawn Olenek. The connection was not accepted simply because a genealogical lead looked convincing. Investigators needed confirmation. A family relationship had to be established. Samples were compared. The evidence was examined. And finally, the conclusion became undeniable. Princess Doe was Dawn Olenek. The announcement in 2022 ended 40 years of anonymity. But for investigators, it was also the beginning of a new phase. Now they could revisit every old lead through the correct identity. Every missing person report. Every witness statement. Every photograph. Every claim. Every location. Every person connected to Dawn. Old evidence could suddenly take on new meaning. Something investigators had once dismissed because there was no apparent connection might now fit the timeline. A person previously described only as an unknown acquaintance could become identifiable. A trip that once seemed meaningless could become significant. A memory that had faded could suddenly matter. The identity breakthrough effectively turned the investigation inside out. For 40 years, investigators had started with the body and worked outward. Now they could start with Dawn's life and work backward toward the body. And that is where the story becomes particularly haunting. Because Dawn had not simply appeared in New Jersey. She had traveled there somehow. She had encountered people. She had entered places. Someone had seen her. Someone had spoken to her. Someone had known where she was. Someone had seen her alive for the last time. That person carried a piece of the mystery. Perhaps without realizing it. Perhaps knowingly. Perhaps for years. The cemetery itself could only reveal the end. The real story existed somewhere before that moment. Investigators had to reconstruct it from fragments. Kinlaw's statements became especially important. Authorities said he had described meeting Dawn and attempting to lure her into prostitution. According to the prosecution's account, Dawn refused. That refusal was allegedly followed by violence. The circumstances were horrifying precisely because the confrontation could have ended differently. Dawn could have walked away. Someone could have intervened. A stranger could have noticed. A passing driver could have seen something. A single phone call could have changed everything. But none of those things happened. Instead, she became a victim. Then her body was taken to the cemetery. And the world lost her identity. The passage of time made the investigation harder. Witnesses age. Memories change. Documents disappear. Places are demolished. People relocate. Technology improves, but evidence also deteriorates. A cold case is a race against time. Every year can erase another fragment. Yet Princess Doe's case survived. That survival was not automatic. It depended on investigators who refused to close the file simply because decades had passed. It depended on forensic specialists willing to work with evidence recovered long ago. It depended on genealogists tracing family connections. It depended on relatives willing to provide DNA. And it depended on the basic principle that an unidentified victim deserves the same determination as any other victim. That principle is easy to state, much harder to maintain for 40 years. The public knew her as Princess Doe. The name became famous. It appeared in documentaries. Newspapers revisited the mystery. People created theories. Photographs were studied. Facial reconstructions were circulated. The girl became a symbol. But symbols can create distance. Dawn was not a symbol. She was a person. She had a name before the cemetery gave her another one. She had a family before investigators gave her a case number. She had a life before her death became a headline. And perhaps the most painful part of the entire story is that her family lived through decades of uncertainty, while Dawn's remains were already in a marked grave. The answer was physically present. It was simply hidden behind the wrong name. That is what made the 2022 identification so powerful. The grave did not change. The victim did not change. The evidence did not suddenly become new. Only the understanding changed. The world finally knew who had been lying there. And once Dawn had her name back, the attention shifted toward the man accused of taking her life. Arthur Kinlaw had already been incarcerated for other murders. His criminal history made the allegations surrounding Princess Doe even more disturbing. He was not an unknown figure who vanished after the crime. He was already known to authorities. He was already serving a sentence. And yet the Princess Doe case remained unresolved for decades. The confession had existed. The body had existed. The evidence had existed. The name had remained hidden. That combination is what makes the case so extraordinary. The murderer may have been closer to the answer than anyone realized. The victim's identity was the missing piece. Without it, the investigation remained fractured. With it, decades of evidence could finally be connected. But there was still something the DNA could not explain. Why Dawn? Why that meeting? Why that journey? Why did the violence escalate? And what happened in those final hours before the cemetery became the last place she would ever see? 40 years had passed. The answers were buried beneath time. Some could be recovered from evidence. Some could be found in old statements. Some could come from Kinlaw himself. And some might never be known. That is the cruel nature of a cold case. Solving the identity does not always solve the entire story. Sometimes the world finally learns the victim's name, while the deepest questions remain unanswered. Dawn Olenek had waited 40 years for the first answer. Now investigators had to confront everything that came after it. Because Princess Doe was no longer an unknown girl. She was Dawn. And somewhere in the distance between her home and that cemetery was the missing story of how a 17-year-old girl disappeared from the world she knew and became one of America's most enduring cold case mysteries. For 40 years, the distance between Long Island and Blairstown had been more than a stretch of highway. It had been a wall. On one side was a family waiting for a daughter who had vanished. On the other was a cemetery holding the body of an unidentified teenager. The two stories existed at the same time. They simply did not know they belonged together. Now that Dawn Olenek had been identified, Investigators could finally place her life on the same timeline as the murder investigation. And that changed everything. The photograph of Dawn was no longer just another missing person image. It was the face of Princess Doe. The teenager in the photograph and the girl beneath the New Jersey headstone were the same person. For investigators who had spent years studying the unidentified victim, the revelation must have carried a strange weight. They had spent decades asking strangers to recognize a face. Now they could finally ask a family. Who was she? What did she do? Who did she know? Where did she go? And, perhaps most importantly, who had been around her immediately before she disappeared? Those questions were no longer hypothetical. They were personal. Dawn's identity allowed investigators to reconstruct a life that had been invisible for decades. But reconstruction is never perfect. A 17-year-old can move through several social circles in a short period of time. Friends know one version of a person. Family members know another. Neighbors may remember almost nothing. Someone who met her once might remember a completely different detail from someone who knew her every day. And the last people to see a victim alive can sometimes become the most important witnesses in a homicide investigation. The problem is that after 40 years, those witnesses may no longer be available. Some may have moved away. Some may have changed their names. Some may have forgotten. Some may have died. And some may have remembered perfectly but chosen never to speak. That is one of the darkest realities of old murder investigations. Time does not only help investigators. Time also helps secrets survive. In Dawn's case, investigators had another advantage. There was a suspect. Arthur Kinlaw had not appeared out of nowhere in 2022. His connection to the case went back years. In 2005, while incarcerated, he made statements claiming responsibility for the murder of the unidentified teenager, known as Princess Doe. That confession was extraordinary. For more than 2 decades, police had been trying to determine who killed the young woman found in Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Then a convicted murderer sitting inside a prison claimed he knew exactly what happened. But even then, the case was not simple. A confession is not the same as proof. Investigators have to ask whether the person confessing actually knows facts that only the killer would know. They have to examine whether the account matches physical evidence. They have to consider motive, opportunity, timeline, location, and whether the person could have known the details from another source. Every statement must be tested. Every contradiction matters. Every detail can either strengthen a case or weaken it. That is especially true when the confession comes decades after the crime. Memories can be distorted. People can exaggerate. Prisoners can make false claims. Some confess to crimes they did not commit. Others reveal information that investigators never previously knew. The challenge is separating truth from noise. Kinlaw's statements therefore became another piece of a much larger puzzle. The investigation continued. The victim's identity remained the critical missing link. Until 2022. When Dawn was identified, the old confession suddenly had a new context. The unidentified girl now had a biography. She had a family. She had a known age. She had a documented disappearance. The pieces could be placed beside one another. And prosecutors could begin presenting the case as the killing of Dawn Olenek, rather than the killing of an unknown teenage girl. That distinction was enormous. For decades, the phrase Princess Doe had carried the mystery. But mystery can sometimes obscure the person. Dawn's name brought the person back into focus. She was not born Princess Doe. She did not choose that name. She did not live under it. It was created after her death because the world did not know who she was. And for 40 years that temporary label became permanent. There is something deeply unsettling about that. A victim can lose almost everything in death. Her future. Her voice. Her ability to tell investigators what happened. But identity is supposed to survive. A name is one of the last connections between a human being and the people who loved them. Dawn lost even that. Until genetic genealogy restored it. The breakthrough also demonstrated how dramatically cold case investigations had changed. In 1982, investigators could photograph the remains. They could collect fingerprints. They could examine dental records. They could distribute descriptions. They could appeal to the public. But the ability to trace distant genetic relatives did not exist. The tools available to investigators had limits. Dawn's killer benefited from those limits. For decades, the investigation could only move as far as the evidence allowed. Then science moved the boundary. That is why old cases sometimes seem to come alive suddenly. The crime does not change. The evidence does not change. The technology changes. A sample that was once merely biological material can become a genetic map. A fragment of DNA can connect a victim to relatives. A relative can point investigators toward a family. A family can point toward a missing child. And suddenly a 40-year-old photograph has a name attached to it. For Dawn, that name was the beginning of closure. But it also forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable question. Why had it taken so long? There had been missing person cases. There had been public appeals. There had been television coverage. There had been facial reconstructions. There had been tips. There had been theories. There had even been a confession. And still the answer remained out of reach. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because nobody is looking. Sometimes it is hidden because the available evidence is not strong enough to reveal it. Princess Doe became the perfect example. Thousands of people may have seen her story. Millions may have heard her name. But recognition requires a connection. Without that connection, information can circulate forever without producing an answer. The clothing was known. The jewelry was known. Her physical characteristics were known. The location of her death was known. But none of those details could say with certainty, this is Dawn Olenek. DNA eventually could. And once the identification was made, investigators could look at the case through a completely different lens. The old photographs were no longer images of an unknown victim. They were photographs of Dawn. The cemetery was no longer the resting place of Princess Doe. It was Dawn's resting place. The case number was no longer attached to an anonymous teenager. It belonged to a 17-year-old girl whose family had been waiting for answers. That transformation is difficult to explain, unless one understands what an unidentified victim means to a family. For investigators, an unidentified body is evidence. For a family, an unidentified body may represent hope. If their missing relative has not been identified, perhaps she is still alive. Perhaps she is somewhere else. Perhaps she will call. Perhaps she will walk through the front door. That uncertainty can last for years. Decades. It can prevent grief from reaching its natural conclusion. The family is neither reunited nor certain of death. They exist in limbo. Dawn's identification ended that limbo. The truth was devastating. She had died in 1982. She had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered. But certainty can be painful and still be better than uncertainty. A grave can finally become a place to mourn. A photograph can finally carry the correct name. A family can finally tell the world who their daughter was. And investigators can finally say that the unidentified victim has been identified. Yet the word identified should never be confused with forgotten. Because the investigation did not end when Dawn received her name. It moved into a different stage. The focus turned toward accountability. Toward the evidence against Kinlaw. Toward the circumstances of the killing. Toward the prosecution. and toward the question of whether the remaining facts could finally establish what happened during Dawn's last hours. The allegations surrounding her death were brutal. According to authorities, Kinlaw had attempted to lure Dawn into prostitution. She refused. The situation allegedly escalated, and the teenager was killed. If those allegations were proven, the murder was not a random act of violence. It was a sequence. A meeting. An attempt to control another person. A refusal. An escalation. A killing. And finally, an effort to dispose of the body. The cemetery became the final scene. But the true crime story had begun much earlier. Every cold case contains a final moment when a victim was still alive. For Dawn, that moment is separated from us by more than 4 decades. We can never speak to her. We can never ask what she saw. We can never ask what she thought. We can never know what she believed would happen next. That silence is permanent. Investigators can reconstruct movements. They can examine evidence. They can compare statements. They can build timelines. But there is always a final gap. The victim cannot fill it. That is why the last known moments of a homicide victim can become so important. Someone else must remember. Someone else must tell the story. And when the case is 40 years old, those memories can become the most fragile evidence of all. Dawn's story also raises another question that has followed unidentified victims for generations. How many other princesses are still waiting? How many unidentified people remain buried beneath incorrect names? How many families still have missing person photographs stored in boxes? How many mothers still wonder? How many siblings still look at an old picture and ask where their brother or sister went? Technology has changed the odds. Genetic genealogy has already transformed numerous cold cases. But the existence of the technology does not guarantee an answer. DNA must survive. Samples must be preserved. Relatives must exist. Records must connect. And investigators must be willing to reopen files that have been sitting untouched for decades. Princess Doe's case proved what could happen when those pieces finally align. The answer had been waiting for 40 years. Not in the cemetery. Not in a newspaper archive. Not in a forgotten police report. Inside the genetic evidence. The evidence did not speak in words. It spoke through relationships. A biological connection. A family connection. A name. Dawn Olenek. The girl who had once been known only as Princess Doe. And yet there remained something almost unbearably tragic about the timing. Dawn had been identified only after 40 years. Her family had spent decades without knowing where she was. The suspect had already spent years behind bars. The world had moved on. New generations had been born. The town had changed. Technology had changed. But the murder had remained frozen. Then, in 2022, time finally moved again. The unidentified girl became Dawn. The case became personal. And the grave acquired the name it should have carried from the beginning. But the story was still not finished. Because knowing who Dawn was did not answer every question about who she encountered, what she experienced, and exactly how the final hours of her life unfolded. The cemetery had kept the last physical evidence. The DNA had restored her identity. The confession had pointed toward a possible killer. Now the investigation had to bring those pieces together. And somewhere inside that 40-year-old chain of evidence was the final truth about what happened to a 17-year-old girl whose name the world had forgotten, but whose story refused to disappear. The deeper investigators looked into Dawn Olenek's story, the more disturbing the timeline became. Because the cemetery was never the beginning. It was the end. By the time someone discovered Dawn's body on that July morning in 1982, the critical events had already happened. The encounter. The journey. the confrontation, the violence. And finally, the decision to leave a 17-year-old girl where she might remain unidentified forever. For investigators in the early years, the absence of a name made every one of those questions harder. They had a victim. They had a location. They had a body. But they did not have a history. They could not simply call her family. They could not search her school records. They could not ask friends when they had last seen her. They could not compare her movements against a known disappearance. They were trying to reconstruct the final chapter of a book without knowing the title. That is why identifying Dawn mattered so much. The name did not merely fill in a blank on a report. It unlocked an entire world. Suddenly, investigators could look for people who had known her. They could revisit her disappearance. They could examine the circumstances that brought her from Long Island toward New Jersey. And they could ask whether someone in her life had noticed something unusual before she vanished. A missing teenager does not simply become a homicide victim in an instant. There is usually a period of transition. A last conversation. A final sighting. A final journey. A person who saw the victim alive shortly before death. That person may have no idea that the moment they remember is historically significant. In 1982, nobody looking at Dawn could have known that she would become one of New Jersey's most famous unidentified homicide victims. Nobody could have known that investigators would spend decades trying to put a name to her face. Nobody could have known that DNA would eventually solve the identity. And nobody could have known that a prison confession would later place a convicted murderer at the center of the investigation. That is what makes cold cases so strange. The importance of an ordinary moment can become visible only decades later. A car ride that seemed insignificant. A conversation that lasted 5 minutes. A person encountered briefly. A decision to go somewhere. At the time, none of it looks like evidence. Later, it can become the missing link. For Dawn, one of the most important questions concerned the circumstances surrounding her contact with Arthur Kinlaw. According to authorities, Kinlaw encountered Dawn and attempted to lure her into prostitution. The allegation is critical because it suggests the relationship between them was not simply accidental. There was an interaction. There was an opportunity. There was a reason for their paths to cross. And according to the prosecution's account, when Dawn refused, the situation escalated into murder. The exact emotional dynamics of that encounter are difficult to reconstruct. What is known is far less than what the victim herself could have told investigators. She could have explained what she was thinking. She could have described what was said. She could have identified the precise moment when she realized she was in danger. But she was never able to speak. The silence of a murdered victim is the most permanent obstacle in any homicide investigation. Every investigator has to work around it. Every prosecutor has to acknowledge it. Every family has to live with it. The only way to overcome that silence is through evidence. Physical evidence. Witness evidence. Documentary evidence. And sometimes admissions from the person accused. Kinlaw's statements therefore became particularly significant. When he claimed responsibility years after the crime, investigators had to examine those statements carefully. Was he telling the truth? Was he trying to gain attention? Was he revealing facts only the killer could know? Could his account be corroborated? The answers matter because a decades-old confession can be both powerful and problematic. A confession can appear to solve everything. But investigators know better. They test it. They compare it. They challenge it. They search for details that could not have been easily obtained from public information. That process takes time. And in a case already 4 decades old, time is never neutral. Every additional year creates another problem. Evidence can degrade. Records can be lost. People can die. Memories can change. But there was one thing that could potentially survive all of it: DNA. The genetic evidence preserved from the investigation became increasingly important as technology improved. At the beginning of the case, biological material could provide limited information. Decades later, advanced forensic techniques could extract far more. The investigation involving the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Astrea Forensics represented a new approach. Instead of trying to identify Dawn solely through conventional missing person comparisons, investigators could use genetic genealogy. That method changed the question. The investigators were no longer asking the public to recognize a dead girl's face. They were searching for biological relatives. That difference was enormous. A face can change. A photograph can be misleading. A reconstruction can be imperfect. But DNA carries biological relationships. The trail led toward Dawn's family. Once a potential connection appeared, investigators needed confirmation. A genealogical lead is not itself the final answer. The relationship must be verified through direct DNA comparison. That happened. And the conclusion was clear. The unidentified girl was Dawn Olenek. 40 years of uncertainty ended in a laboratory. Not in the cemetery where she was found. Not in the courtroom. Not through a dramatic confession. In DNA. That detail should never be overlooked. The case became a demonstration of how modern forensic science can reach backward through time. The investigators who found Dawn's body in 1982 could not have imagined the tools available in 2022. They were working with the science of their generation. The investigators who identified Dawn inherited their work. That is one of the most important features of cold case investigations. The people who solve the case are often not the people who began it. They inherit questions. They inherit evidence. They inherit mistakes. They inherit incomplete files. And sometimes they inherit a victim who has been waiting decades for someone to say her name. Dawn was one of those victims. The announcement of her identification brought an end to the identity mystery. But it also forced the public to reconsider the meaning of the name Princess Doe. For 4 decades, people had associated that name with a faceless mystery. A young woman found dead in a cemetery. A victim whose identity seemed impossible to recover. But Princess Doe was never really a mystery person. She was a mystery only to investigators. To her family, she had always been Dawn. That distinction is profound. The case was not about discovering whether she had existed. It was about recovering information that had been taken from her. Her name. Her history. Her connection to a family. Her place in the world. And perhaps that is why the identification was so emotionally powerful. There is a strange finality to being identified after death. The world says, "We know who you were. We know where you came from. We know that you belong to someone. We know your name." For Dawn, that recognition came 40 years too late. But it came. The next challenge was accountability. Arthur Kinlaw had been in custody for other murders. His criminal history meant that the allegations surrounding Dawn were not isolated from a broader pattern of violence. Authorities eventually pursued the Princess Doe case as a murder prosecution. The legal process, however, had to contend with the age of the evidence. A crime committed in 1982 is not tried under the conditions of 1982. By the time prosecutors moved forward, decades had passed. Technology had changed. The available evidence had changed. The victim's identity had changed from unknown to confirmed. And the public memory of the case had evolved. The prosecution had to present a coherent story. Dawn had to be placed at the center of it. Not Princess Doe. Dawn. A 17-year-old girl. A daughter. A teenager who should have been planning her future. Instead, Investigators were reconstructing her death. That contrast is devastating. The victim's age makes the case impossible to view as merely another criminal statistic. 17. 1 year before adulthood. 1 year before legal adulthood in many parts of the United States. She was still at an age when many people are deciding what they want to become. Dawn never got that opportunity. Her future became a question mark. Her past became a cold case. Her identity became a forensic problem. And her grave became a symbol. The cemetery itself also became part of the mythology surrounding the case. There was something almost surreal about the location. A place associated with remembrance had become the site where an unidentified victim was abandoned. A cemetery is supposed to preserve identity. Names are carved into stone. Dates are recorded. Families visit. But Dawn was placed there without her name. The place of the dead became the place of the unknown. For decades, that contradiction remained. Visitors could see the headstone. They could see the name Princess Doe. But the person behind it was hidden. Now the contradiction could finally be corrected. Dawn had a name. She had relatives. She had a history. And she had a story that could be told accurately. Yet even after identification, there remained an unavoidable truth. Some mysteries die with the victim. There are details no forensic technique can recover. There are conversations no transcript contains. There are thoughts no witness can describe. There are moments that disappear forever. That is why solving a cold case does not always mean knowing everything. Sometimes it means knowing enough to restore dignity. Enough to identify the victim. Enough to establish responsibility. Enough to give a family the truth. But not necessarily enough to reconstruct every second. The Princess Doe case demonstrates that distinction perfectly. The identity was solved. The alleged killer was known. The investigation had moved forward. Yet the emotional mystery of Dawn's final hours remained partly locked in the past. The evidence can tell us where she was found. It can tell us how long she had been dead. It can tell us who investigators believe was responsible. But it cannot tell us everything she felt. Only Dawn could have done that. And Dawn was gone. That silence is what remains after every cold case is solved. Even when a name is recovered. Even when a suspect is identified. Even when a courtroom hears the evidence. There is still a final unanswered space. The victim's own voice. For 40 years, Dawn had no voice in the public record. She was Princess Doe. A nickname. A photograph. A mystery. A headline. Now her name could finally be spoken. Dawn Olenek. And with that name came a responsibility. To stop treating her as a mystery first and a person second. She was a person first. The mystery came afterward. She was alive before she was murdered. She had a family before she became a cold case. She had a name before investigators gave her an alias. And after 40 years, the world finally had the opportunity to remember that order correctly. Dawn first. Princess Doe second. The unidentified girl was no longer unidentified. But the question that had begun in that cemetery still echoed through the case. Why did it take 40 years for the truth to find its way home? The answer was not a single failure. It was a combination of time, technology, incomplete information, distance, and silence. And perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. The truth was never necessarily gone. It was waiting. Waiting inside old evidence. Waiting inside family memories. Waiting inside genetic connections. Waiting for technology to catch up with a crime committed in another era. And when it finally did, the name that emerged was not Princess Doe. It was Dawn. A 17-year-old girl whose life ended in 1982, but whose identity survived long enough to be recovered 4 decades later. Her story had begun as a mystery. It had become a national cold case. And eventually it became something even more personal. A reminder that behind every unidentified body is a person who once had a name. Someone was looking for her. Someone remembered her. Someone was waiting. And sometimes, even after 40 years, the evidence can still find the way home. For Dawn Olenick's family, the discovery in 2022 was not the end of a nightmare. It was the end of not knowing. For 40 years, the question had been suspended in time. Where was Dawn? What happened to her? Was she alive? Was she dead? If she was dead, where was she? And if she had been murdered, who had done it? The first answer had finally arrived. She was dead. She had been found in New Jersey. She had been buried there. And the girl known for 4 decades as Princess Doe had been Dawn Olenick. But the second answer carried far more weight. Who had taken her life? Investigators had been asking that question long before they knew her name. In the early years, they had almost nothing with which to begin. A body. A cemetery. A brutal homicide. A young victim who could not identify herself. There was no obvious trail leading back to her family. No document placed her in Blairstown. No identification connected her to Long Island. The case was built from fragments. Every fragment mattered. The clothes. The jewelry. The physical injuries. The location. The estimated time of death. The condition of the body. And the people who might have seen something. But a murder investigation requires more than clues. It requires connections. And for decades the connections were missing. Then Arthur Kinlaw entered the story. His name changed the investigation because he did something investigators had spent years trying to make happen. He spoke. In 2005, Kinlaw claimed responsibility for the killing of Princess Doe. The statement was extraordinary. The unidentified girl had been dead for more than 20 years. The case had become a cold case. And suddenly, a man in prison was saying that he knew what had happened. But even then, there was an unsettling problem. Who exactly had he killed? He could describe the victim. He could claim responsibility. But investigators still could not tell her family that the girl was Dawn Olenick. The confession therefore existed in a strange state. It potentially identified the killer, while the victim remained unidentified. That is almost the reverse of a normal homicide investigation. Usually, investigators know the victim and search for the offender. Here they were trying to solve both mysteries simultaneously. Who was the dead girl? And who killed her? For years, those questions remained intertwined. The identification of Dawn finally separated them. Now investigators could focus directly on the circumstances surrounding her death. They could compare Kinlaw's statements with what was known about Dawn's disappearance. They could examine whether his account was consistent with the physical evidence. They could determine whether the chronology made sense. And they could begin to construct a prosecutable case. The transformation was dramatic. Before 2022, the phrase Princess Doe represented an unknown teenager. After 2022, it represented a specific victim. Dawn Olenick. That name changed the emotional meaning of every piece of evidence. The necklace was no longer simply evidence recovered from an unidentified body. It belonged to Dawn. The clothing was no longer merely a description for the public. It was what Dawn had been wearing when her life ended. The cemetery was no longer just the scene where an unknown victim was found. It was the final place Dawn's family could visit. The cold case had become personal. And with that personalization came a painful realization. For 40 years, Dawn had been physically close to the answer. Her remains were in New Jersey. Her family was elsewhere. The two sides were separated not by a continent, but by an information gap. The body was known. The family was searching. The name was missing. DNA finally closed that gap. The identification process itself represented one of the most remarkable developments in the case. Investigators did not simply find Dawn's name in an old database. They used modern genetic genealogy to trace biological relationships. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved. Forensic specialists worked with preserved evidence. A genetic profile was developed. Researchers searched for relatives. The trail eventually led to the Olenek family. And then came direct confirmation. DNA established the connection. The unknown teenager had become Dawn. This was more than a forensic achievement. It was an act of restoration. Her family could finally mourn the correct person. They could finally place her life in context. They could finally understand that the mystery they had carried for decades had an answer. But the answer was devastating. Dawn had not simply vanished. She had been murdered. That realization can be harder than uncertainty. For 40 years, hope may exist in the absence of certainty. A missing person can still be imagined somewhere. A dead victim cannot. The identification closed the door on that possibility. But it opened another. Justice. The authorities could now pursue the case under Dawn's name. The prosecution's allegations described a violent encounter. Kinlaw allegedly attempted to lure Dawn into prostitution. She refused. The encounter escalated. And according to prosecutors, Kinlaw killed her. The details are difficult to read because the victim was so young. 17 years old. A teenager confronted by a man who allegedly wanted to control her. A refusal. Then violence. The circumstances demonstrate how quickly a dangerous situation can become irreversible. One moment can separate an ordinary encounter from a homicide. For Dawn, that moment became the final turning point of her life. Afterward, her body was transported to Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Why that cemetery? Why leave her there? Was it chosen because the killer knew the area? Was it chosen because it offered concealment? Was it simply a place the killer believed would delay discovery? Those questions matter because the disposal site can sometimes reveal the offender's familiarity with the area. The cemetery was not an accidental detail. It became part of the case's identity. The location was remote enough for a body to remain undiscovered for a period of time. But it was not remote enough to guarantee secrecy. Eventually, someone found her. And the discovery changed the community. A peaceful cemetery became a crime scene. A teenage girl became a national mystery. And the town became associated with one of the most enduring unidentified person cases in America. People began asking whether someone local knew something. Had anyone seen an unfamiliar vehicle? Had anyone noticed a suspicious person? Had anyone heard something? Had anyone seen Dawn? Had anyone seen the person who brought her there? Every question created another possibility. But no witness could immediately provide the missing answer. The case remained open. Years became decades. The girl in the cemetery became an icon of unresolved crime. Her reconstruction appeared repeatedly in the media. The public learned her measurements, her clothing, her jewelry, the circumstances of her death. But there was one thing nobody could provide. A family photograph with her real name. That was the cruelest absence. A face without a history. A body without a family. A grave without a surname. The word princess carried an almost tragic irony. It sounded beautiful. But it was born from anonymity. She was called Princess Doe because nobody knew who she was. The name was never meant to replace Dawn. It was a placeholder. A temporary identity. Yet temporary identities can become permanent when the truth takes too long. For 4 decades, generations grew up knowing the case. People who were children when Dawn was found became grandparents before she was identified. Investigators who first handled the evidence retired. Some died without knowing the answer. The original witnesses grew older. The case changed hands. But the victim remained 17 forever. That is another strange feature of cold cases. Time moves around the victim. The victim does not move with it. Dawn remained the same age. Her photograph remained the same. Her estimated height remained the same. Her clothing remained frozen in the case file. But the world around her changed completely. Cars changed. Phones changed. Computers changed. DNA technology changed. Investigative methods changed. The internet transformed how missing people could be searched for. And eventually, genetic genealogy created a path that investigators in 1982 could never have imagined. The breakthrough also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. Had biological material been discarded? Had records been destroyed? Had the case been forgotten entirely? The answer might have been different. Cold cases depend heavily on preservation. Evidence has to survive long enough for future investigators to use it. Dawn's case survived because the evidence remained. That meant technology had something to work with. The laboratory became a bridge between 2 eras. 1982. 1983. 2 worlds connected by a biological sample. The significance of that cannot be overstated. When investigators first encountered Princess Doe, they were looking for a name. 40 years later, science gave them one. But the story of Dawn Olenek is not simply a story about technology. It is a story about persistence. Because technology only works when someone decides to use it. Someone has to reopen the file. Someone has to request new testing. Someone has to examine old evidence with new eyes. Someone has to believe that the answer is still there. That belief kept Princess Doe from becoming another forgotten victim. The same principle applies to every cold case. A case can become old. It does not necessarily become irrelevant. The passage of time does not make a victim less deserving of justice. It only makes the path to justice more difficult. Dawn's case shows both sides of that reality. 40 years created enormous obstacles. But 40 years also gave science time to evolve. The technology that failed to identify her in 1982 did not have to be the technology that failed her forever. Eventually, the tools changed. The evidence remained. And the name emerged. Dawn Olenek. Yet even after the identification, one haunting image remained. A teenage girl lying alone in a cemetery. Nobody knew her name. Nobody knew where she belonged. Nobody knew who was waiting for her. Investigators could not tell her mother where she was. They could not tell her family what had happened. They could only tell the public. We need your help. For decades, that plea remained unanswered. Then, 40 years later, the answer came from a place nobody in 1982 could have used. Her DNA. The final irony is that the thing that ultimately identified Dawn was not the public recognition investigators had hoped for. It was not a stranger looking at a photograph and saying, "I know her." It was her biological connection to a family. A relationship encoded inside her DNA. A biological signature that survived longer than memory. And once that signature was matched, the mystery of her identity was over. But another kind of silence remained. The silence of a 17-year-old girl who could never tell anyone what happened. That silence is what investigators, prosecutors, and Dawn's family must confront. Because the name can be restored. The grave can be corrected. The suspect can be charged. But no courtroom can give Dawn back the years she should have lived. No forensic breakthrough can restore the future she lost. No verdict can erase the violence. Justice can acknowledge what happened. It cannot undo it. And that is why the Princess Doe case remains so powerful. It began with an unknown body. It became a national mystery. It survived 4 decades. It was transformed by DNA. And finally, the unknown girl became Dawn Olenek. But behind that extraordinary identification was an ordinary tragedy. A 17-year-old girl died. A family lost a daughter. A community gained a mystery. And a cemetery gained a name that would become famous across the country. For 40 years, people searched for Princess Doe. The truth was that they were searching for Dawn. And somewhere between those two names lies the entire tragedy of the case. Because the world had spent decades asking who Princess Doe was. The answer was much simpler. She was Dawn. She had always been Dawn. The world just needed 40 years to catch up. But the discovery of Dawn's identity did not make the cemetery silent. If anything, it made the silence louder. For 40 years, people had walked past the grave of Princess Doe knowing almost nothing about the teenager buried beneath it. Now they knew her name. Dawn Olenek. 17 years old. A daughter. A young woman whose life had been interrupted before it had truly begun. And suddenly the grave carried a different weight. The mystery had changed. The question was no longer simply, who is she? It became, what happened to Dawn? That question was much harder. A name can be found in a database. A family relationship can be confirmed through DNA. But a person's final hours are different. They exist in the memories of witnesses, in physical evidence, in statements made years later, and sometimes in the words of the person accused of causing the death. And in Dawn's case, investigators had all of those elements in varying degrees. The most important was the confession. Arthur Kinlaw had already claimed responsibility years before Dawn was identified. That meant the investigation did not begin from zero. But it also meant investigators had to determine whether his account could be trusted. Kinlaw was already a convicted murderer. His history made his statements impossible to ignore. But it also made them impossible to accept blindly. A confession from a convicted killer is not automatically the truth. Investigators have to ask why. Why would he confess? What did he know? How did he know it? Did he reveal information that had never been publicly released? Did his account fit the physical evidence? Did it fit the timeline? Did it fit the victim? Those questions became increasingly important after Dawn's identification. Because now the investigators could compare the confession against the life of a real person. Dawn had disappeared. Kinlaw claimed responsibility. The unidentified victim had been found in New Jersey. DNA proved that victim was Dawn. 3 facts that had once existed separately could now be placed on the same timeline. That was the breakthrough. The case no longer depended entirely on reconstructing an unknown victim. Investigators knew exactly who they were trying to understand. And that allowed them to revisit old information with new questions. Cold cases are often solved this way. A clue that appears meaningless in isolation can become significant when placed into a new context. A name changes the value of old evidence. A date changes the value of an old statement. A relationship changes the meaning of a location. A photograph changes the meaning of a missing person report. Dawn's identification transformed the case from an unidentified homicide into the investigation of a specific young woman whose life could be traced. But there was another challenge. Dawn's life before New Jersey was separated from the murder by geography. She was from Long Island. She was found in Blairstown. The distance between those places was not just physical. It represented the unanswered story of how she came to be there. Investigators needed to understand her movements. Who had contact with her? Who might have traveled with her? What circumstances led her away from home? What happened between her disappearance and the discovery of her body? The answers were buried in a timeline that had been broken for decades. That timeline became one of the central mysteries of the case. The final known hours of a victim are often reconstructed backward. Investigators begin at the body. They establish when the victim likely died. Then they move backward. Where was she before that? Who saw her? What transportation did she use? What locations could have been involved? Who had an opportunity to encounter her? Every hour becomes important. Every confirmed sighting narrows the window. Every contradiction widens it. But Dawn had been dead for decades. The witnesses who could have answered those questions had lived through an entire generation before investigators finally knew her name. Some may have forgotten details. Others may have remembered but never understood their importance. And some questions may have no surviving witness at all. That is the brutal arithmetic of time. 40 years does not merely add 40 years to a calendar. It removes people from the investigation. The investigator who originally interviewed a witness may no longer be alive. The witness may no longer be alive. The suspect may remember differently. The physical scene may no longer look the same. A building can disappear. A road can change. A neighborhood can transform. The cemetery remains. The grave remains. But the world surrounding them moves forward. Dawn could not. She remained 17. That fixed age became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Everyone who remembered her grew older. Dawn did not. Her family aged. Her friends aged. The investigators aged. The suspect aged. The country changed. But the victim remained frozen at the moment her life ended. That is the strange cruelty of homicide. The victim never gets to experience time. Everyone else does. And for the people who loved Dawn, every passing year must have carried another layer of uncertainty. Birthdays without her. Holidays without her. Family events without her. Years in which nobody knew whether to mourn or hope. There is no ordinary grief when a person is missing. Death is final. But disappearance leaves a door open. Maybe she will return. Maybe there is an explanation. Maybe someone knows. Maybe tomorrow will bring a phone call. Then 40 years passed. The phone call never came. Instead, the answer arrived through forensic science. That answer was devastating. But it also gave Dawn's family something they had been denied for decades. Certainty. They could finally know where she was. They could finally visit her. They could finally say her name in connection with the grave. They could finally separate the memory of Dawn from the mystery of Princess Doe. That distinction matters because the public had spent decades discussing Princess Doe as a case. Her family had spent decades missing Dawn as a person. The media asked, "Who is Princess Doe?" Her family asked, "Where is Dawn?" Those questions sounded similar. They were not. One was an investigation. The other was grief. The identification finally brought those two worlds together. And it also changed the story for people who had followed the case for years. For some, Princess Doe had become almost legendary. She was one of America's most recognizable unidentified victims. Her case was discussed alongside other famous Jane Doe investigations. Her image became associated with the mystery of identity. But once the name Dawn Olenek was announced, the mythology became less important. The girl became more important. That is often the most meaningful moment in an identification. The unknown person becomes known. The case becomes a life story. The headline becomes a human being. And Dawn's life story had been interrupted by violence. According to authorities, Kinlaw's encounter with Dawn involved an alleged attempt to recruit her into prostitution. She refused. That refusal, according to the prosecution's account, was followed by the fatal attack. The sequence is chilling because the alleged motive begins with control. Someone wanted something from Dawn. Dawn said no. The situation allegedly turned violent. That single word, no, became central to the tragedy. The details of the confrontation cannot be fully recovered. Dawn is not here to describe them. But the prosecution's theory places the refusal at the center of the events leading to her death. Then came the disposal of her body. Cedar Ridge Cemetery. A location associated with the dead. A place where someone might expect a body to remain hidden among graves and trees. But the plan failed. Dawn was discovered. Her death became an investigation. Her body became evidence. And her identity became the greatest unanswered question. The killer may have believed that anonymity would protect him. If nobody knew who the victim was, perhaps the case would remain unsolved. For years that seemed possible. But anonymity did not last forever. Technology changed the equation. The DNA survived. And eventually it led home. That is the part of the story that seems almost impossible when viewed from 1982. Imagine telling investigators at the cemetery that 4 decades later, they would use DNA to identify the victim through distant relatives. They might not have believed it. The tools did not exist. The databases did not exist. The computational methods did not exist. The idea that a biological sample from an unidentified murder victim could lead investigators to a family tree would have seemed like science fiction. But it became reality. And that reality changed the case permanently. The identification also demonstrated why unidentified victims matter. Every unknown person is potentially connected to a family. Every unidentified body represents an unanswered question somewhere. A missing person case may be waiting for an unidentified person case to match it. Dawn's case was exactly that. 2 records. 2 mysteries. 1 person. The missing girl from Long Island. The unidentified victim from New Jersey. They had been separate for decades. DNA connected them. That connection restored Dawn's name. But the investigation into her death required another kind of connection. The connection between the suspect and the crime. Kinlaw's confession was part of that equation. The prosecution could now present it alongside the newly confirmed identity. The state could tell the story of Dawn. The disappearance. The encounter. The alleged motive. The killing. The discovery. The decades of uncertainty. The genetic identification. And the eventual pursuit of the case. For the first time, the entire narrative could be told using the victim's real name. Dawn Olenek. Not Princess Doe. Not Jane Doe. Not unknown female. Dawn. That simple change carried enormous significance. Names are evidence of existence. To speak someone's name is to acknowledge that they were here. Dawn had been here. She had lived. She had been loved. She had been missed. And now she could finally be mourned. Yet the case remained a reminder that justice can move at a different speed from truth. The truth about Dawn's identity took 40 years. The truth about her murder required another process. And even when investigators believe they know what happened, a courtroom demands evidence. That distinction is crucial. A cold case investigation may produce strong suspicions. A confession may seem convincing. A forensic breakthrough may establish identity. But criminal responsibility must still be demonstrated through evidence. That is why the case continued beyond the announcement of Dawn's identity. The headlines changed. The questions changed. The public attention shifted. But the investigators kept working. Because identifying the victim was not enough. The person who killed her still had to be held accountable. And for Dawn's family, that was the final piece of an answer that had been missing for 4 decades. They finally knew where Dawn was. They finally knew who she was. Now they needed the world to understand how she died. That is the difference between finding a body and solving a murder. The first tells you where the victim ended. The second tries to explain how she got there. Dawn's body had been waiting in Cedar Ridge Cemetery since 1982. Her name had been waiting inside her DNA. And the story of her final hours was waiting inside the evidence. 40 years had hidden the first answer. Time had tried to bury the second. But the case refused to stay buried. The cemetery had given investigators a mystery. The laboratory gave them a name. And the investigation now had to determine whether the remaining evidence could finally give Dawn something else. Justice. Justice was now the word attached to Dawn Olenick's name. For decades, justice had seemed almost impossible. There had been no confirmed identity. No family standing publicly beside the victim. No complete timeline. No certainty about the events that had carried a 17-year-old girl from Long Island to a cemetery in New Jersey. But now there was a name. And there was a suspect. Arthur Kinlaw had been connected to the case long before Dawn's identity was established. His 2005 confession had placed him directly inside the investigation. But the passage from confession to prosecution was not automatic. A confession could point investigators toward the truth. It could not replace evidence. The state needed to establish a coherent chain. Dawn Olenick was the victim. Kinlaw was allegedly responsible. The circumstances of their encounter had to be demonstrated. The physical evidence had to be examined. The statements had to be tested. The timeline had to make sense. And the case had to survive the standards of a courtroom. That is where cold cases become particularly difficult. A murder can be obvious. A suspect can seem obvious. But a prosecution requires more than an obvious story. It requires evidence strong enough to withstand challenge. For Dawn's case, the investigation had an unusual advantage. The suspect had already spoken. But it also had an unusual disadvantage. His statements had been made decades after the murder. Time creates uncertainty. A person can remember incorrectly. A person can deliberately lie. A person can exaggerate. A person can claim responsibility for crimes for reasons that have nothing to do with truth. Investigators therefore had to separate the confession from the evidence surrounding it. Did the details align? Did the circumstances match? Did the information make sense in light of what investigators already knew? The answer could not simply be based on the fact that Kinlaw said he did it. The entire case had to be examined. That examination took place against a disturbing background. Kinlaw was already serving sentences for other first-degree murders. His criminal history meant investigators could not simply dismiss his confession as an isolated statement from an unknown person. He was a convicted killer. But that fact alone did not prove that he had killed Dawn. The Princess Doe case had to stand on its own evidence. That distinction is important. A person's past does not automatically establish guilt in a new case. Every victim deserves an investigation based on what happened to them. Dawn deserved that same standard. Her murder had to be proved as Dawn's murder, not simply added to an existing criminal history. And that meant revisiting the old evidence. The location where Dawn was found. The injuries. The clothing. The biological evidence. The statements. The circumstances of her disappearance. The confession. The identification. Each element had to fit. The most dramatic breakthrough had already occurred. DNA had identified Dawn. But DNA identification is different from DNA proving who killed someone. It answers one question. Who is the victim? It does not automatically answer another. Who caused the death? That distinction is easy to overlook when a cold case is discussed in headlines. The public sees a breakthrough and assumes the mystery is over. Investigators know better. One solved question often reveals another. Princess Doe became Dawn. Now the investigation had to establish what happened to Dawn. And the more investigators reconstructed the story, the more important the old details became. The clothing she wore. The jewelry she carried. The place where she was discovered. These details had seemed like fragments of an unknown life. Now they were pieces of Dawn's final story. The cemetery was particularly significant. It had become the defining location of the case. For 40 years the words Princess Doe and Cedar Ridge Cemetery had been linked. People remembered the location because of the contradiction. A place built around death and remembrance had become the site where an unknown teenage murder victim was abandoned. It was a place full of names. Yet Dawn had arrived without one. The cemetery contained thousands of identities carved into stone. She had none. That contrast became part of the emotional power of the case. When Dawn was finally identified, the meaning of the location changed. The cemetery was no longer simply the place where Princess Doe was found. It was the place where Dawn's remains had rested for decades. The grave became personal. The mystery became personal. The investigation became personal. But justice required more than emotion. It required facts. The years after Dawn's identification were therefore not simply about celebrating a breakthrough. They were about testing the case. Authorities had to establish whether the available evidence supported criminal charges. The prosecutor's office eventually announced that Kinlaw had been charged with first-degree murder in connection with Dawn's death. The charge represented a dramatic transformation. The case that had once been filed under an unknown victim now had a named victim and a named defendant. The headline could finally contain both. Dawn Olenek. Arthur Kinlaw. The names belonged together in the criminal case. But behind those names were 40 years of history. Dawn had been 17 when she died. Kinlaw had continued living. That contrast is difficult to ignore. The victim's life stopped. The suspect's did not. He grew older. He entered prison. He served sentences for other murders. The world changed around him. Meanwhile, Dawn remained 17 in every photograph. That imbalance is one of the most disturbing realities of unsolved homicide. The victim is frozen. Everyone else moves forward. For Dawn's family, the years could not simply be erased. Every year without an answer became part of their lives. Then the answer came all at once. Dawn was dead. Her body had been found in 1982. The man authorities accused of killing her was already incarcerated. The mystery had survived for decades, but its central pieces had finally emerged. The legal process could now begin. And yet there was still a painful limitation. No prosecution can recreate the lost years. No indictment can return a 17-year-old girl to her family. No court hearing can restore the future that ended in that cemetery. Justice is not resurrection. It is accountability. It is the public recognition that a crime occurred, and that the person accused of committing it must answer for it. For Dawn, even that recognition had taken decades. The investigation also demonstrated how differently a case can look at different moments in history. In 1982, investigators were looking at a body. In the 1990s, they were looking at forensic possibilities. In 1999, her remains were exhumed for additional DNA testing. In 2005, a confession emerged. In 2021 and 2022, genetic genealogy created a path toward her family. Each stage built upon the previous one. None was enough alone. That is what makes the eventual identification so remarkable. It was not one miracle. It was a chain. Investigators preserved evidence. Forensic specialists developed new methods. Genealogists followed genetic connections. Relatives provided DNA. Authorities confirmed the result. And finally, the name Dawn Olenek was announced. Every stage mattered. Remove one link and the chain might have broken. That is why cold case investigators often emphasize preservation. Evidence can outlive people. A biological sample can survive a witness. A photograph can survive an investigator. A case file can survive a detective's retirement. And sometimes the evidence survives long enough for a future generation to understand what an earlier generation could not. Dawn's DNA became exactly that kind of evidence. Cross 40 years. It crossed generations. It crossed the gap between an unidentified victim and a family. And it did something even more profound. It changed the way people spoke about her. Before 2022. Princess Doe. After 2022. Dawn Olenek. The first name described the mystery. The second described the person. The distinction matters because crime reporting can unintentionally turn victims into symbols. A famous case can become larger than the person at its center. The name becomes a brand. The photograph becomes an icon. The mystery becomes entertainment. But Dawn's identification offered a chance to reverse that. The story could begin with the victim again. Not with the mystery. Not with the killer. Not with the sensational headlines. With Dawn. A 17-year-old girl. A young person whose life was still unfolding. Then came the violence. Then the disappearance. Then the cemetery. Then 40 years of anonymity. Then the DNA breakthrough. And finally the return of her name. The chronology is simple. The emotional reality is not. Because for Dawn's family, the story was not 4 decades long. It was continuous. They had not experienced the case as a documentary. They experienced it as absence. A missing person. A daughter who never came home. A question without an answer. The announcement of her identification therefore had a meaning that statistics cannot capture. It meant the waiting was over. The uncertainty was over. Dawn could finally be buried under her real name. Her family could finally stand beside her grave knowing who was there. That kind of closure does not erase grief. It gives grief somewhere to go. And for investigators, it gave the case a new purpose. Not simply to identify, but to establish responsibility. The prosecution's theory provided a possible explanation for Dawn's final hours. Kinlaw allegedly encountered her. He allegedly tried to recruit her into prostitution. She refused. The confrontation allegedly became violent. Dawn was killed. Her body was left at the cemetery. It is a horrifying sequence. But every part of it had to be supported. The legal system does not operate on atmosphere. It operates on evidence. That is why the decades-long investigation remained important even after the emotional breakthrough. The case could not simply end with a press conference announcing Dawn's name. Her identity answered one question. Her murder demanded another answer. And the search for that answer was now taking place with something investigators had never possessed before. A complete identity. Dawn's name gave the case a center. It allowed every clue to be organized around a real life. Every witness could be reconsidered. Every record could be revisited. Every statement could be examined against a known timeline. The case had finally moved from mystery toward reconstruction. And reconstruction is where the most difficult questions began. What exactly happened before Dawn reached New Jersey? Who knew she was there? Who saw her last? What did Kinlaw know? What did he tell investigators? What evidence supported his statements? And what remains unknowable after 40 years? Those questions could not be answered by DNA alone. They required the patient work of homicide investigators. They required prosecutors. They required forensic specialists. They required historical records. And they required the willingness to reopen a story that many people had assumed would remain unresolved forever. The case had already defeated time once. It had survived 40 years without a name. Now it faced another challenge. Could the truth about Dawn's death survive the courtroom? Could the evidence bridge the enormous gap between 1982 and the present? Could justice finally catch up with a crime committed when the world was a very different place? Those questions remained hanging over the case. But one thing had changed permanently. The victim was no longer unknown. The girl in the cemetery had a name. And once investigators learned that name, there was no reason to let the rest of her story remain buried. Dawn Olenek had waited 40 years to be identified. Now the investigation had to speak for her. Because she could no longer speak for herself. Justice was not a single moment. It was a process. And for Dawn Olenek, that process had begun long before the world knew her name. In the years after her body was discovered, investigators had worked with an impossible problem. They knew a teenager had been murdered. They knew where she had been found. They knew what she had been wearing. They knew she had been beaten. But they did not know who she was. That missing identity had consequences far beyond the wording of a case file. Without a name, investigators could not reconstruct her life. Without a life, they could not easily reconstruct her final movements. And without those movements, the circumstances of the murder remained fragmented. The case therefore existed in two separate worlds. The world before the cemetery, and the world after it. The cemetery was known. The victim was not. Decades later, DNA finally connected those worlds. But once Dawn's identity was confirmed, investigators faced a question that had been waiting behind the first mystery. Could the evidence establish exactly what had happened to her? The answer required going back through the history of the case. The investigation had never truly stopped. It had changed shape. In the beginning, detectives searched for a missing girl who might match the unknown victim. Later, they relied increasingly on forensic evidence. Then came the confession from Arthur Kinlaw. And finally came genetic genealogy. Each development answered one question while creating another. Who was she? Dawn Olenek. Who was responsible? Authorities identified Kinlaw as the man they believed had killed her. But what happened between those two facts? That was the heart of the prosecution. According to authorities, Kinlaw encountered Dawn and attempted to lure her into prostitution. She refused. The encounter allegedly escalated into violence. Dawn was killed. Her body was transported to the cemetery. And she was left there. That theory transformed a decades-old mystery into a sequence of events. But a sequence still had to be proven. The legal system could not simply rely on the emotional power of the case. The victim had been unidentified for 40 years. The suspect had been incarcerated for years. The confession had come long after the murder. The evidence had aged. Every element had to be examined. And this is where the passage of time became both an enemy and an unexpected ally. Time had damaged the investigation. But time had also produced technology that did not exist when Dawn died. DNA analysis had advanced enormously. Genetic genealogy had opened a completely new avenue for identifying unknown victims. The same evidence that could not answer the question in 1982 could become decisive decades later. That transformation is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the Princess Doe investigation. The investigators did not discover new remains. They did not discover a new victim. They did not find a hidden diary. They found a new way to understand evidence that had been preserved for decades. The evidence had been waiting. Science finally caught up with it. The identification process eventually connected the unidentified teenager to Dawn's family. A relative provided DNA. The relationship was confirmed, and the name became official: Dawn Olenek. The announcement in 2022 closed one of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the case. But it also made the next stage possible. Investigators could now look at every known fact through the lens of Dawn's actual life. Her disappearance was no longer an isolated missing person mystery. It was connected to the murder investigation in New Jersey. The victim and the missing girl were one person. That realization may sound obvious now, but for 40 years it had been invisible. The investigation had been searching in two directions. One side searched for Princess Doe. The other searched for Dawn. Neither knew they were looking for the same girl. That is what makes unidentified person cases so difficult. The victim may exist in another jurisdiction under another report. A family may report someone missing. Another police department may have unidentified remains. The databases may not connect them. The names may be different. The descriptions may be incomplete. And years can pass before technology creates the connection. Dawn's case became a powerful example of what happens when that connection is finally made. The girl who had been missing from her family was already buried. The body investigators had been trying to identify belonged to her. The answer had existed physically for decades. It simply had not been recognized. Now the investigation could move beyond identity, and the focus returned to Arthur Kinlaw. His statements about the killing had been part of the case since 2005. That fact added another layer to the story. Kinlaw had not been identified through DNA as a stranger suddenly emerging from nowhere. He had already inserted himself into the investigation through his own statements. The question was whether those statements could be corroborated. That distinction became central. A confession can be powerful, but the strongest cases do not depend on a confession alone. They depend on independent evidence. A confession can tell investigators where to look. Physical evidence can tell them whether the story fits. Witness testimony can establish movements. Records can establish timelines. Forensic evidence can establish relationships. Together, those elements can transform an allegation into a case. The Princess Doe investigation had accumulated evidence across decades. The challenge was bringing all of it together. The victim's identity was now certain. The suspect's connection had to be established. The circumstances of the killing had to be explained. And the prosecution had to show why the evidence pointed toward Kinlaw. This is the point where the sensationalism of a cold case meets the discipline of criminal investigation. The public may remember the mystery. Investigators remember the details. Dates. Locations. Statements. Evidence. Contradictions. Connections. Every detail has to survive scrutiny. And Dawn's case had one enormous advantage that many cold cases never receive. The person accused of killing her was still alive. He could be questioned. His previous statements could be examined. His account could be compared against the newly confirmed identity. And the state could finally bring the case forward under the victim's real name. For Dawn's family, that must have changed the meaning of every public announcement. For decades, the words Princess Doe represented a girl they did not know was theirs. Now the name was Dawn. Their Dawn. That is why the identification was more than a forensic breakthrough. It was an emotional reversal. For 40 years, the world had been asking strangers to identify her. After 2022, the world could finally introduce her. Dawn Olenek. The 17-year-old girl who had disappeared from Long Island. The young woman whose remains had been found in New Jersey. The teenager whose identity had remained hidden for 4 decades. and the victim whose case ultimately led investigators back to a man already serving time for murder. The contrast is striking. Dawn's life ended at 17. Kinlaw continued living. The case continued. The investigation continued. The suspect's life continued behind prison walls. Dawn's did not. That imbalance is at the center of almost every long-running homicide investigation. The victim is frozen at the moment of death. The rest of the world moves forward. New children are born. Old buildings disappear. Families change. Investigators retire. Technology evolves. And the victim remains the same age. Dawn's photograph did not age. The young woman in it remained 17. Meanwhile, the people searching for her became older. The investigators who first handled the case could no longer simply return to the beginning. They needed younger investigators to inherit the work. They needed new scientists, new databases, new methods, new questions. That is how cold cases survive. Not because they are forgotten, because they are transferred. One generation hands the evidence to another. The first generation may discover the body. The second may preserve the evidence. The third may identify the victim. The fourth may finally establish what happened. Dawn's case crossed that generational boundary. It became a story about persistence as much as crime. The original investigators could not identify her. But they documented her. They preserved the evidence. They gave the unidentified teenager a public identity. Princess Doe. That name, although temporary, kept the case alive. People remembered it. Journalists wrote about it. Investigators continued to revisit it. The public continued to recognize the face. And that recognition created something important. Visibility. Dawn was not allowed to vanish completely. Even without her real name, the case remained in the public consciousness. That mattered. Because forgotten cases rarely receive new resources. Forgotten victims rarely receive new testing. Princess Doe was never completely forgotten. Then forensic science provided the missing bridge. The name returned. And once it did, the entire case changed. There was no longer a reason to describe the victim only by her injuries. There was no longer a reason to say, unknown female. There was no longer a reason to ask whether she had ever existed. She had existed. Her name was Dawn. And the more the public learned about that fact, the more obvious the central tragedy became. Dawn was not famous when she was alive. She became famous because she died under mysterious circumstances. That is a cruel way for a person to become known. Her greatest public recognition came after she could no longer experience it. The world remembered her because she had been denied the chance to grow older. That is why responsible retelling of her story matters. The mystery should never overwhelm the victim. The killer should never become more important than the girl. And the sensational details should never replace the human reality. Dawn was 17. That is the fact that should remain at the center. Everything else follows from it. A teenager disappeared. A family waited. A body was discovered. A mystery developed. A suspect emerged. Technology advanced. A DNA trail led home. And 40 years later, the unknown victim became Dawn Olenek. But justice still had another mountain to climb. Identification establishes who died. It does not automatically establish why. It does not prove every detail of the final hours. It does not answer every question about the killer's intentions. And it does not restore the life that was taken. Those questions require evidence. They require patience. And sometimes they require accepting that some details may remain permanently unknown. That is perhaps the hardest lesson of the Princess Doe case. A cold case can be solved without every mystery disappearing. The victim can be identified. The suspect can be charged. The evidence can become stronger. And yet there may still be moments that only Dawn knew. Moments that died with her. The final conversation. The final thought. The exact moment she understood she was in danger. The exact moment her life changed forever. Those details may never be recovered. And perhaps no technology will ever retrieve them. But the most important facts survived. Her name survived. Her family survived. The evidence survived. And the investigation survived. 40 years could not erase Dawn Olenek. It only delayed the moment when the world would finally know who she was. And after 4 decades of being called Princess Doe, the most important word in the case was no longer mystery. It was her name. Dawn.